The rain hit the windshield like small stones the night everything in my life quietly rearranged itself, and I didn't even know it yet. I was 26 years old, driving a beat-up sedan that coughed every time I hit 40 miles an hour, working a job that barely covered rent, and I had no idea that helping one drunk stranger stumble into my back seat would put my entire career on a collision course with the truth. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in the idea that one small decision can change the direction of a person's whole life, then before you go any further, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me you're watching, share this with someone who needs a reminder that good things can still happen to good people, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get into it. My name is Daniel Reyes, and at the time this story begins, I was working as a junior logistics coordinator at a mid-sized shipping company downtown. It wasn't glamorous. I spent my days chasing down late deliveries and fixing other people's spreadsheet mistakes, and my nights were spent trying to stretch a paycheck that never quite stretched far enough. My father had passed 3 years earlier from a heart condition that could have been caught early if we'd had better insurance, and ever since then I had been quietly carrying the weight of supporting my mother, who worked part-time at a laundromat and refused, out of stubborn pride, to accept more help than she thought she needed. I wasn't bitter about my life. I was tired. There's a difference, and if you've ever worked a thankless job just to keep the lights on for someone you love, you already know exactly what I mean. That Friday night, I had just left a coworker's birthday dinner at a small restaurant near the waterfront. It wasn't a wild night. A few drinks, some laughs, nothing memorable. I was walking to my car when I saw her. A young woman, maybe early 20s, sitting on the curb outside a bar with her heels in her hand and her makeup running down her cheeks in dark, uneven lines. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't loud or obnoxious the way people assume drunk strangers are in stories like this. She was just sitting there, alone, shivering slightly in the cold, looking like the world had somehow tilted sideways and she hadn't figured out how to stand back up straight. I almost walked past her. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. In a city like ours, you learn to keep your head down, to not get involved, to assume someone else will handle it. But something about the way she was sitting there, so small against the concrete, so far from wherever home was supposed to be, made me stop. I asked if she was okay. She looked up at me with glassy eyes and said she just needed to get home, but she couldn't remember her address, and her phone had died, and she didn't have any cash for a cab even if she could remember where she lived. She wasn't trying to manipulate me. She wasn't putting on an act. She was simply a person who had had too much to drink and had nowhere else to turn in that moment. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know how these stories can sound. I did not see her as an opportunity. I did not think about what she looked like or what she was wearing or anything like that. I thought about my little sister, who was around the same age, and how I would want a stranger to treat her if she were ever stuck somewhere alone and vulnerable. I thought about my mother's voice in my head, the same voice that raised me, telling me that you help people when they need help, not when it's convenient, and not when there's something in it for you. So I helped her into my car. She mumbled a name of a neighborhood that sounded vaguely familiar, one of the nicer parts of town, the kind of place with gated driveways and manicured hedges that I had only ever driven through, never actually visited. I drove slowly, partly because of the rain and partly because I kept glancing over to make sure she hadn't passed out completely. She drifted in and out of coherence, apologizing at one point for crying, thanking me at another point for not being, in her words, a creep about it. At one point she asked me why I was helping her when I didn't even know her, and I told her the truth, that I would want someone to do the same for my sister. She went quiet after that, and I remember thinking she had fallen asleep, but when I glanced over again, she was just staring out the window with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. When we finally reached the address she'd given me, a 2-story house behind a wrought iron gate with security cameras mounted discreetly under the eaves, I helped her out of the car and walked her to the door because I didn't trust her to make it up the steps alone in the rain. The porch light came on before we even reached the top step, and the door opened to reveal a man in a robe, his face a mixture of panic and relief that I recognized instantly, because I had seen that exact face every single Monday morning for the past 2 years across a conference table. It was my boss. Richard Calloway, the regional operations director, the man who signed off on my performance reviews and decided whether or not I got a raise that year. And the drunk girl in my back seat, the one I had just spent the last 40 minutes trying to keep safe, was his daughter, Emily. For a moment, none of us said anything. Richard stared at me like he was trying to solve a math problem that didn't add up. Emily, still swaying slightly, mumbled something about her dad not being mad, and then Richard's expression shifted from confusion to something quieter and more complicated, a kind of exhausted fear that I recognized because I had seen it on my own mother's face more than once when I was younger and got home later than I should have. He thanked me, his voice tight, and asked how I had found her. I explained everything as simply as I could, leaving out nothing but adding nothing either, and I watched something in his shoulders loosen, just slightly, as he realized his daughter had been safe the entire time, in the hands of someone who had no reason to help her except that it was the right thing to do. I want you to imagine what that must have felt like from his side. A father getting a call, or in this case, no call at all, just the sudden appearance of his daughter at the front door, disheveled and vulnerable, brought home by a stranger in the middle of the night. There is a very specific kind of terror that comes with not knowing where your child is, and an equally specific kind of relief when that fear resolves itself safely. I didn't fully understand that in the moment, but I would come to understand it much more deeply as this story unfolded. I drove home that night without thinking much more about it. I didn't expect a reward. I didn't expect recognition. I genuinely believed that by Monday, this would be nothing more than an awkward memory, the kind of thing you don't bring up at work because it feels too personal, too strange, too far outside the normal boundaries of a professional relationship. I went to bed that night feeling, if anything, a little uneasy, wondering if Richard would somehow resent me for having seen his daughter in such a fragile state, wondering if this would create a wall between us rather than a bridge. Monday morning came, and I walked into the office expecting business as usual. Instead, Richard called me into his office before I had even set my bag down at my desk. My stomach dropped in that particular way it does when you're not sure if you're about to be praised or fired. He closed the door behind me, which he rarely did, and for a moment he just looked at me across his desk, the same desk where I had nervously presented quarterly reports a dozen times before. He told me that Emily had been going through a difficult year. Her mother, his ex-wife, had remarried and moved across the country, and Emily had taken it hard, throwing herself into a social scene that had grown increasingly reckless over the past several months. He told me he had tried talking to her, tried setting boundaries, tried everything a father could think of, but nothing seemed to reach her. And then he told me that the night I drove her home wasn't the first time she had been in a dangerous situation. It was, however, the first time a stranger had treated her with decency instead of taking advantage of the situation, and that fact alone had shaken something loose in her. He said that Emily had come to him the next morning, sober and shaken, and told him everything, including how frightened she had been sitting on that curb, and how surprised she was that I hadn't asked for anything in return, hadn't tried anything, hadn't even seemed impatient with her. She told her father that it made her think about the kind of people she had been surrounding herself with, and the kind of person she wanted to become instead. Richard's eyes were wet as he told me this, and I remember feeling a lump form in my own throat, because I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a story about a lucky coincidence. It was a story about how a small act of decency can ripple outward in ways you never anticipate. Over the following weeks, something between Richard and me shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He began stopping by my desk more often, not to check on deadlines, but to ask how I was doing, how my mother was doing, whether I had family nearby. He started including me in conversations I hadn't been part of before, meetings with senior leadership, discussions about long-term projects that were usually reserved for people much higher up the ladder than a junior coordinator like me. I didn't ask for any of it. I didn't angle for it. It simply happened, the natural result of a man recognizing character in someone and wanting to invest in it. But the part of this story that moves me most isn't the professional opportunities that eventually came my way, as meaningful as they were. It's what happened with Emily. About a month after that night, Richard invited me to a small family dinner, an invitation that felt strange and unearned at first, but one I accepted because I sensed it mattered to him. Emily was there, and for the first time, I saw her sober, clear-eyed, and quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than sad. She thanked me again, this time with none of the slurred, half-formed gratitude from that rainy night, but with a steadiness that told me she meant every word. She told me that night had scared her in a way she hadn't expected, not because anything bad had happened, but because it made her realize how easily something bad could have happened, and how little control she'd had over her own safety in that moment. She said she had started seeing a counselor, had cut ties with a group of friends who had been encouraging her worst habits, and had begun rebuilding her relationship with her father, one honest conversation at a time. She said she often thought about the fact that a stranger's kindness had been the turning point, not a lecture, not a punishment, just quiet, unremarkable decency at a moment when she desperately needed it. I think about that conversation often, because it taught me something I didn't fully understand before that night. We spend so much time assuming that the big, dramatic gestures are what change lives, the grand speeches, the life-altering interventions, the moments engineered for maximum impact. But more often, it's the small things. It's stopping when you could have kept walking. It's driving someone home instead of leaving them on a curb. It's treating a stranger with the same care you'd want shown to someone you love, without ever knowing if you'll be thanked for it, or even remembered for it at all. My own life changed in ways I never could have predicted from that single decision. Richard became not just a boss but something closer to a mentor, and eventually a friend. He championed my growth within the company in ways that had nothing to do with favoritism and everything to do with finally being seen. Within 2 years, I had moved into a management role I never would have imagined reaching so quickly, not because of who I knew, but because someone had finally taken the time to notice the work I had quietly been doing all along. My mother no longer had to work as many hours at the laundromat, and for the first time since my father passed, I watched some of the tiredness lift from her face. But if I'm honest, the promotions and the paycheck increases were never the real reward. The real reward was watching Emily, over the following months and years, become someone who radiated a kind of hard-won peace, someone who eventually went back to school, who mended the relationship with her father that had once felt unsalvageable, who told me once, with tears in her eyes, that she sometimes thinks about where she might have ended up if that night had gone differently. If the person who found her on that curb had been someone with different intentions. If this story has touched your heart even a little, if it's reminded you that kindness doesn't need an audience to matter, that the smallest decisions we make can echo far beyond the moment we make them, please take a second right now to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it helps stories like this one reach more people who need to hear them. And before we close this out, I want to ask you something directly. Comment below and tell me about a moment when a stranger's kindness changed your life, or a moment when your own small act of decency ended up mattering more than you ever expected. I read every single one, and I promise you, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. In the end, I don't think I did anything extraordinary that rainy night. I simply chose not to look away from someone who needed help. But sometimes that's all it takes, one person choosing not to look away, to set into motion a chain of healing that touches far more lives than we could ever imagine standing there in the rain. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing this story, it's that you never truly know how much your kindness might be worth to someone else, until years later, you look back and realize it changed everything.